And thank you very much to Charles and Matthew for inviting me. And it's an interesting talk for me to give today. This is the first time that I've given this talk about this piece of work. And it connects to some of my previous work. I've always wanted to go to a particular place called St. Peter's Cardross, which is famously a modernist seminary from the 1960s that very quickly became a ruin. And it's appropriate to, I've started work on a new book called Architecture as a Time Machine, that this title refers to. And I knew that somehow that St. Peter's Cardross would fit really well into that theme. So if you go to the next image, please. And so this is the project, finished opened in 1966. And I have to thank very kindly, all the images come courtesy of the Kilmahue Education Trust, who are actually based in Bath, but have now acquired the site of St. Peter's Cardross, and I'll refer a little bit to that in the talk. So if you go to the first image, and you'll see that each of the sections of the lecture is divided, each has a subtitle, and the first one is a biblical deluge, and the images come from, there's a few by me, but generally they're by rather better photographers than me. And then some of them are by Kai McLaughlin, who's a student in our unit at the moment. And we all went as a unit to St. Peter's Cardross in November. And then many of the images are by Yang Tian Zhou, who is a graduate of our unit, who's also an architectural photographer. So at the start of each section, you'll see who the images are by. So if you go to the first one. So, on a bitter midwinter day, the train stops at Cardross, a small town on the north bank of the Clyde. Mist and drizzle hang in the breezy air, deepening the chill and obscuring the wide river estuary. Walking north, we pass through nondescript housing until the tarmac becomes mud, and the track slowly curves to the east. Entering dense woodland, our route reaches the wrecked stone walls of the West Lodge, and as soft drizzle turns to leaden rain, we dodge deep pools in the heavily rutted track. Clamorous echoes of surging water precede first sight of the bridge across Kilmahue Burn. The stone parapets are badly fractured as vandals regularly dislodge and cast fragments into the deep gorge of the burn. Reflecting the accretion and decline of Britain's once imperial reach, plant specimens transported to the 19th century estate are now dispersed across luxuriant woodland, and the abandoned landscape has developed with little human intervention, representing rewilding before it became relevant and popular. Even in midwinter, dense foliage blankets the hillside, diminishing views, and as the track continues to rise, circling to the north, we see the serried concrete of St. Peter's Seminary for the first time. Next image, please. Passing the massively curved sanctuary wall, the biblical deluge engulfs the site, and it was quite incredible weather. And Stuart was one of the co-directors of the Kilmahue Education Trust. Stuart, you're there. I've only just noticed you. It's lovely to see you.
Out of the way.
Real pleasure to see you. Thanks a lot for being here. That was good timing, wasn't it? Just notice it at that moment. So this is Stuart. He's one of the co-directors of the Kilmahue Education Trust. So passing the massively curved sanctuary wall, the biblical deluge engulfs the site. Floated raindrops explode on landing, and deep dark puddles subsume the chapel floor. Ruined due to decades of neglect, vandalism, arson, graffiti, and water ingress in a windy coastal environment, the mechanical surfaces, timber roofs, wooden windows, and furniture are all lost. And Harley, which is a rough cast, lime and aggregate wall finish used throughout Scotland as weather protection, peels away from cylindrical side chapels, revealing the pockmarked brick structure beneath. Only the three-dimensional, reinforced concrete fabric remains intact, a skeletal ghost of a decayed body, and distinctions between interior and exterior are absent. The seminary is silent, but woodland sounds pervade the structure, such as bird song and the roar of two burns that converge nearby. Everyday human occupation is missing, but bats, foxes, and insects are constant inhabitants, and graffiti layers every surface. Algae, lichen, and moss glow green, yellow, orange, and ochre. And I think notably, environmental upheaval is often conceived in biblical metaphors as punishment for human failing. Next image, please. And then to this is building a seminary, and you'll see first image is mine, and then the next three are by Yang King. So located in the Archdiocese of Glasgow, where 3/4 of Scottish Catholics reside, St Peter's College has 3 times suffered ruination. The first through fire in 1956, which led to its relocation at Cardross, 40 miles to the west. In 1948, trainee priests were rehoused in Kilmahew House, a turreted Scottish baronial mansion built of locally quarried grey-green stone. And the building was designed by John Burnett, the elder, and completed in 1868 for John William Burns, who was the son of the founder of the Cunard line. The estate is named after the nearby 6th century church of St Mayhew, one of the first Christian sites in Scotland. Now, throughout the 20th century, there were attempts to reconcile faith and modernity. And the key figures in the Archdiocese at this time, in the 1950s and 60s, were theologically conservative, but architecturally adventurous. In 1953, they first discussed a newly expanded seminary with Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer, the Archdiocese's preferred architects throughout the 20th century, including the expansionist building program of the late 50s and early 1960s, that reflected the growing prosperity of the Catholic congregation. Incorporating a chapel, library, refectory, partial block, individual study bedrooms for over 100 trainees, and separate convent building, the final design was commissioned in 1959, and construction began in 1961. Now, Jack Coyer led the firm, but actually he wasn't really the designer of this project. The principal designer was Izzy Metzstein, with significant contribution from Andy Macmillan and also John Kell. And Macmillan recalls the Vicar General responsible for the new buildings. And this is what he says. Bishop Ward knew that I was an atheist Protestant. He knew Izzy was an atheist Jew, and he knew Jack was an atheist. But he knew Jack was a Catholic. Jack kissed his ring. And the architect's desire to amend and improve their design led the builders to nickname the Altar Boys, which is obviously A-L-T-E-R. Play on words. An impressive design, but not an innovative one. St Peter's is comparable to other exemplary buildings designed in a creative era when modernism expanded into a polycentric, worldwide network of distinct, varied, and interdependent regional and local modernisms. Sounds like we've got builders here, doesn't it? Le Corbusier's influence on St Peter's is obvious, notably by the monastery around Red, which was from 1959. But recalling Louis Kahn, pale timber walls, doors, and furniture softened and domesticated St Peter's concrete frame. And the Nordic of mid-century Nordic modernism was also evident, including the furniture, which was sourced from Glasgow and Scandinavia. And local Scottish influences include the expressive, elemental, hard volumes and gridded doors of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House, which was finished in 1902, and is at Helensburgh, which is just 4 miles west of Cardross, and it's now archived rather beautifully, like a doll's house, with incumbent rocks projected mesh box. And in this St Peter's final design, 3 new horizontal wings form a cloister, and this is one of the wings that you see now, framing the vertical turrets of Kilmahew House in the centre of the composition, and emphasising St Peter's isolation. The entry route led across a breached east moat under the main block and through to the cloister at low level. And the west elevation was left open to celebrate long views to the estuary over sloping woodland. Next image, thanks. Now, although modernist, St. Peter's conforms to the traditional model of a scholarly retreat in recuperative nature. And a 4th century monk who translated the Bible into Latin, St. Jerome was a favourite subject of Renaissance artists. And the best known depiction is a painting by Antonello da Messina called St. Jerome in his study from 1675. And this shows the monk in a simply furnished, raised timber enclosure, which is like half room and half furniture, set within a cloister with frames used for the landscape beyond. And if you'd seen St. Peter's at the time it was opened, you would have seen a very similar arrangement where there was a sort of timber enclosure to a concrete structure rather than a stone structure in St. Jerome's case. And discussing paintings and sculptures in which St. Jerome is shown in either wilderness or study, Alison Smithson, who was born in 1928, like Macmillan and Medstein, remarks that these habitats can be also thought of as allegories for the restorative place in nature and the energizing cell supported by human order. So it's quite a traditional idea of a seminary in an isolated setting. But the liturgical forms of the Second Vatican Council, which were from 1962 to 1965, concluded that the church should be fully integrated within society, abandoning Latin as the language of the sacraments and initiating a significant policy change from rural to urban seminaries, overturning a policy which had been in place since the Council of Trent from 1593. And the 2 principal lessons of St. Jerome in his study were no longer relevant. Notably, his father, John Simmons, who was one of the people who lectured there at that time, called St. Peter's a monument to being out of touch. Already redundant while under construction, the new buildings opened in 1966. And even in that year, St. Peter's College magazine recorded, and this is one of the columns of that time, the morning floodwaters greeted our arrival in the chapel, but there was no Moses to conduct us through. And soon afterwards, winds over 100 miles an hour battered the estate, and the great storm of January 1968 was Scotland's worst natural disaster since records began, predicting that St. Peter's increasing fame would be proportionate to its increasing ruination. Father James Foley recalls a visit in the 1970s. And he said that Coyer showed wide-eyed architectural students around the building while we mopped up rainwater from the floor. Other ongoing complaints were woodworm, fungus, and the bitter cold. And limping on for just 14 years, the seminary closed in 1980. A symbol of eternity entering a temporal world, the altar was later broken into pieces on the order of the Archbishop of Glasgow. Next image, please. So the location, design, and technical failings, inadequate heating and insulation, exacerbated by the 1970 oil crisis, the declining number of student priests, and the Archdiocese's financial problems all contributed to the closure. And between 1983 and 1987, the seminary was repurposed as a drug rehabilitation centre and then quickly fell into ruin. Cataclysmic fire engulfed St. Peter's for the second time when Kilmahue House was devastated by arson and then demolished in 1995. And the new buildings stood in isolation with the void at their centre. Incarcerated in concrete, the seminary's rigid spatio-temporal rituals suited the spatial hierarchy and formal expression of each functional element in modernist composition, but they hindered successive proposals for reuse as a hotel, conference centre, housing and arts venue. And further reasons are the green application and the incorporation of a protected site and building. Now, paradoxically, the isolated setting actually preserved the ruined seminary, while an urban site would no doubt be redeveloped. And St. Peter's was largely ignored, while becoming increasingly known nationally and internationally. And in the 1990s, Medstein, who was the principal designer, quipped, this is what he said: "I can certainly say that if they try to pull it down, I'll have the last laugh." the building would be almost as difficult to demolish as it was to build. And acknowledging that the specificity of the design made it difficult to convert, he would rather enjoy the idea of everything being stripped away except the concrete itself. And he said, a purely romantic conception of the building as a beautiful ruin. Next image, please. This is one of Tianzhou's images again. In less than 3 decades, St. Peter's had become not just any ruin, and I think this is quite important to bear in mind, it's not any ruin at all. It reminds people of a particular type of ruin, which is a Pyreneesian ruin, fulfilling the dreams of architects and travellers since the 18th century. And St. Peter's extreme condition recalls Giovanni Battista Piranesi's favourite subject, Hadrian's Villa, of Tivoli from the 2nd century AD. And rather ironically, it's a precursor to today's graffitiists. Piranesi actually incised the graffito Pyrenesi 1741, soon after visiting Hadrian's Villa for the first time. And human and non-human forces have combined to create both Hadrian's Villa and St. Peter's. Material erasure, as in neglect, vandalism and weathering, and material accumulation, as in graffiti, lichen and moss, occurred simultaneously as well as sequentially. And Hadrian's Villa took centuries to acquire its dilapidated condition, but St. Peter's quickly transformed from a Corbusian building into a Pyreneesian ruin. And sort of recognising this, really, in 1992, Historic Scotland, which is the main sort of conservation body in Scotland, awarded St. Peter's the highest Category A status. Appropriately, they honoured a ruin, not a building. And the Renaissance's allegiance to classical ideas ensured that the effects of time, nature, and weather on buildings were deemed to be negative in that time, in the Renaissance. But by the 18th century, and Piranesi is very much an architect of the 18th century, the ruin's connotations were more complex and even positive, involving a temporal metaphor representing potential as well as loss, and an environmental model combining nature and culture. Rather than just appreciate ruins, architects began to model buildings on ruins. And the book actually that Charles mentioned about, that the theme of that is we all think of buildings becoming ruins, but there's actually a very strong tradition of buildings designing, of architects designing buildings as ruins, actually modelling them on ruins. And really that tradition, you can say, initiated with Pyrenesi. Whether designed or found, an overgrown ruin was a familiar feature of 18th century picturesque estates, offering minimal services and basic waterproofing, and intended for occasional visits, not permanent inhabitation. And a contemporary observer described William Kent's Richmond Hermitage from 1931, this is what he said, as a heap of stones thrown into a very artful disorder and curiously embellished with moss and shrubs, which you could apply to St. Peter's now. And in an essay from 1795 called An Essay on the Picturesque, Uvedale Price introduces time as a way to differentiate between aesthetic categories, and he equates beauty with youth and the picturesque with age, roughness and variation, which he associates with the autumnal hues of mosses, lichens, and incrustations on trees and buildings. Again, a description from the 18th century that could easily be applied to St. Peter's. And acquiring temporary custody of the St. Peter's site in 2011, the arts organisation NVA was, in their words, fearful not to ruin the ruin, clearing away debris to emphasise the concrete skeleton and removing thousands of rhododendrons to allow the woodland to breathe again. An NVA acquired planning permission in 2013 but failed to proceed. And the Albatross, which is the Archdiocese's term for St. Peter's, the Archdiocese around the Archdiocese neck, was finally removed when the Kilbyhue Education Trust acquired legal ownership at no cost in 2020, with the Archdiocese concluding that this represented the first suitable long-term and viable solution in 40 years. Next image, thanks. So this one, if you think the last section was building a seminary, this one is building a ruin with a couple of Tianzhou's images again. Thanks. Now, mid-century modernists reaffirmed an appreciation of history that was latent but mostly suppressed in early modernism, as in Le Corbusier's Vers une architecture from 1923, which was published in English as Towards a New Architecture in 1927. And in that book, Le Corbusier praises the light play on pure forms and the simple masses of ancient Rome, and below sketches of elemental forms, including a cylinder, pyramid, cube, rectangle, and sphere, he depicts Rome as a city of juxtaposed monuments, which is very much in the spirit of Pyreneesian. Le Corbusier offered equal praise to the Athenian Acropolis, and in his appreciation of the machine aesthetic, seen in his analogy of modern cars to ancient temples, there is an echo of Plato's praise for the beauty of solids produced on a lathe or with a ruler and square. But the Second World War was a more scientific war than the first, and in the shadow of wartime bombing and the new threat of nuclear devastation, technology evoked the sublime through failure even more than success. And modernism's early confidence in scientific progress and dismissive reaction to social norms and cultural memories became anachronistic. Failure to articulate societal values and gain widespread respect in the first half of the 20th century led post-war modernists to emphasize the expressive potential of monumentality rather than transparency, of dark rather than light, and rough rather than smooth. And simultaneous concern for a building model on a monumental ruin was stimulated by memories of wartime destruction, indicating not only the destructive force of humanity and nature, but also heroic resistance to decay and the continuing relevance of ancient forms, which are denied of absolute authority and thus a greater stimulus to the imagination. The return of history in the post-war era meant the return of the ruin. In the 18th century, Pyreneesian, Robert Adam, and John Soane established the practice in which a building is modelled on a ruin, which led Louis Kahn in 1961 to characterize his design strategy as wrapping ruins round buildings. Now, demolition is essential to construction, and building sites often appear ruinous. And recalling Robert Smithson's phrase of 1967, Alison Smithson remarked in 1976 that, and this is what she said, a building under assembly is like a ruin in reverse. So I think what that means is that beginning even during construction, a building becomes a ruin in advance as it ages and decays. And the process of ruination begins the day the construction workers enter the site, continues while the building is in use, and develops further after it's no longer occupied. Next image, please. As well as modelling their designs on ruins, post-war architects predicted the ruination of their buildings. And Macmillan describes St. Peter's as a brutalist building of that era. As precedents for brutalism, Alison and Peter Smithson cite Le Corbusier's use of béton brut, which is raw concrete, in the 1950s, which Rainer Ballum also mentions. And concrete was extensively employed in ancient Rome, while reinforced concrete was developed in the 19th century as a hybrid of fine and coarse aggregates, cement and water with steel reinforcement, which an early pioneer, Auguste Perret, very evocatively described as an ancient material turned modern. And St. Peter's two construction processes, both employed at St. Peter's, emphasize the dialogue between old and new. Standardized and repetitive, precast concrete with a variegated pebble aggregate facing was formed in a factory and quickly assembled on site as an industrial process. And in situ concrete was poured into purpose-made formwork in the open air and closer to a craft process. A memorial to the weather as its constituent materials set and solidified, and bearing the imprint of its formwork to the shapes and surfaces of a lost timber building, concrete was popular among architects not in the early 20th century when they dismissed history, but in the post-war era when they rediscovered history. Architects selected concrete because of the meanings it suggested, as much as any practical advantage it offered. And crucially, they chose it as a material before cement's high carbon emissions and detrimental environmental performance was widely acknowledged. Emphasizing concrete's primitivism to recall both archaic forms and recent devastation, Le Corbusier characterized the angled roof lines at the monastery of La Tourette as cannons and machine guns, while the monks described the pockmarked surfaces as stigmata of suffering. And Rainer Banham concluded that they lived in, a magnificent ruin. Of equal importance to concrete's adoption as the material of mid-century modernism, it was associated with the new rights and responsibilities offered by the monolithic, egalitarian institutions of the post-war welfare state, as in repetitive study bedrooms piled high in a ziggurat, a form that appears in numerous 1960s institutions, including St. Peter's. Now, St. Peter's architects state that this is a quote from them, that they built exactly to the same program as La Tourette, which is really not quite true, because as Father Foley remarks, he criticized a false monasticism inherent in the building for trainee priests, not for trainee monks. And St. Peter's initial services were not as raw as at La Tourette, but even in Murray Grego's film, which was Space and Light from 1972, the walls are heavily streaked and strained by the harsh coastal weather, just halfway through its short life at the seminary. A monument to modernist myopia, St. Peter's fulfilled its destiny as a ruin. Architecture does not just exist in time, it creates time, travelling forward as a message to the future. However, there is nothing as old-fashioned as a past vision of the future. Next image, please. So this one is a section called Primitive Eye. Most of the images are by Kai McLaughlin. So this one, a beautiful one. Now, according to Metzstein, it is only by looking back that we can intellectualize. However, he added a limit to this statement, and he said, modern architecture is very eclectic. There is nothing that is not allowed to be in modern architecture, as long as the spirit is modern. It is sort of contradictory, really, if you think about it. And St. Peter's architects absorbed Victorian Kilmahew House into their composition, but Metzstein vehemently dismissed the possibility that their work was postmodern or pre-modern. And this is what he said: definitely not. I can swear on a stack of Bibles if you wish. I certainly would not associate myself with that idea. Bound by ideas of progress, St. Peter's architects were less appreciative of the pre-modern than British contemporaries such as Alison and Peter Smithson, and far removed from another contemporary, Robert Venturi. And Alison Smithson remarked, this is a quote, I work with memory, and it allows me to make connections to the past, interpretation of the present, and give foresight, a most valuable facility for an architect as to a possible future. And in Complexity and Contradiction from 1966, Venturi praises mannerism, modernism, and Main Street, advocating both and pluralism, while St. Peter's architects were closer to Venturi's either-or late modern alternative, which even their hero, Le Corbusier, did not follow. Next image, please. Many of you will know Charles Jenks' book, A Language of Postmodern Architecture from 1976. Most discussions in architecture tend to associate postmodernism with that period and with Jenks. But actually, a decade earlier, Nicholas Pevsner said this. He questioned the overpowering brutality of the postmodern style of Le Corbusier and Denis Lasdun, and he did that in 1966. But I'd say it's more accurate to describe their post-war work as simultaneously pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. And more perceptive than gents and conscious of how ideas develop and change, in 1979, Jean-François Lyotard included the postmodern within the modern, acknowledging the process by which a new artwork questions an earlier one. His categorization is dynamic and not specific to an era. And he said, a work can become modern only if it is first postmodern. Postmodernism, thus understood, is not modernism at its end, but its nascent state. And in Lyotard's schema, we become postmodern to remain modern. Next image, please. Instead, I'd say that St. Peter's became pre-modern to remain modern. It became a ruin to remain relevant. And in the completed design, the most intriguing space offers three alternative routes from the lower ground floor cloister. And that's an image of that space. And you can go online and see the Murray Gregor, which is films of St. Peter's. It's quite interesting to see it in its sort of complete and occupied state. And one of the spaces he shows is this one. And in the film, you see to the left, the gentle processional route rises upwards towards the top-lit sanctuary, chapel, and altar, following the curve of the high altar wall. The stepped, vaulted profile of the chapel balcony casts serrated shadows onto the sanctuary ramp and outer wall. And in the centre, a broad ramp floor steps down to the double-height crypt, which is lined with protruding concrete altars in recessed niches and lit by miniature coloured glass windows punched into the depths of the outer wall, recalling Corbusier's chapel at Ronchamp from 1955. And to the extreme right, a timber-lined mezzanine, low ceiling enclosed sacristy, which includes wardrobes and vesting tables and leads to a single narrow opening. And that's a description of what it would have looked like in 1966. And this is a photograph of what it looks like now. Today, the same view offers a dramatic chiaroscuro, a contrast of light and dark. The cloak of darkness expands from left to right. First, the embers of heavenly rays illuminate scaffolding and graffiti along the curved ramp. In the center, the somber curved wall frames the dark recessed niches. And finally, to the right, the single opening punches through the enveloping gloom. One of the things I think that's interesting is that the way we view in the dark, the way which is quite different to the way we view in the light. And the human eye actually adjusts quite quickly to light, but very slowly to the dark. It takes about 7 minutes or so to adjust to a degree of lightness, and over an hour to darkness. And St. Peter's cavernous recesses permit travel back into evolutionary time to a primitive eye barely capable of detecting shadows, and an archaic understanding of time when it was measured in daylight and moonlight. And that's actually part of it. That is a quote from Richard Gregory's book, Eye and Brain. And Richard Gregory actually calls vision intelligent guesswork. And I'd say it's a form of time travel that uses past knowledge to generate a plausible internal construction of a present external reality. Because it's hard to believe, but we don't actually receive enough information in our brain to create an image. So the brain is always extrapolating, always taking information for what it knows. And offering an infinity of interpretations, the eyes receive inexact information, and the brain extrapolates from previous knowledge and experience to create a plausible, seemingly comprehensible image that is notably incomplete and vague in the dark. Shrouded in darkness, all buildings become ruins. Even the most intact structure appears broken, arcane, and ambiguous. And that's an image of the facade with the precast concrete elements which still survive. And I'd say that St. Peter's time travel journey also includes its materials and occupants. We tend to think of the materials that we specified as new in some way, But they might have been newly fabricated. But in 1966, the newly fabricated St. Peter's included building materials that were both natural materials of various ages, including 100-year-old trees, iron and carbon mined in the Earth's crust and fused with steel or alloy, and stone aggregate formed millions of years ago and set in concrete. And today, the more fragile building materials are absent, having either been eroded, destroyed, or stolen, and only the in situ precast concrete elements remain, alongside new facing materials such as graffiti and moss. In most buildings today, we unknowingly live alongside other creatures, mostly insects. And today, apart from the occasional visit of graffiti artists, St. Peter's regular occupants are not people, but bats, birds, foxes, insects, winds, rain, and the dark night sky. And St. Peter's collides material traces of a pre-human past, outdated fabrication technologies of a human past, and flora, fauna, and phenomena of the present. And as you probably noticed, one of the things that's interesting about these images is that there's a form of time travel in them, in that most of them were taken in either December or in August. This is the next theme, which is as-bound, which is very much a term used in the 1960s. And this is an image of a detail of the moss growing on the hull volumes of the side chapels, which is one of Kai's ones. And the idea of the British welfare state was established in 1942. William Beveridge's Interdepartmental Committee presented its report to the wartime coalition government led by the Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And the Labour Party's landslide victory in 1945 brought the report's conclusions to fruition. Modernist architecture had little success in Britain before the Second World War, but construction of the welfare state stimulated a need for modernist architecture that was representative of its social programme. And after 15 years, wartime and post-war rationing in the UK finally ended in 1954, leading to rising prices. But consumerism was so buoyant that in 1957, the incoming Conservative Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, famously remarked that people have never had it so good. Architectural practices benefited from the building boom and the expansion of the welfare state, but still stimulated by the ethos of wartime make-do and mend and rationing. Appreciation of the as-bound permeated architect thoughts. And this is Andy Millen was interviewed quite late in his life in 2013, and he contrasted the early 21st century to an earlier era that influenced St. Peter's design and construction. This is what he said: capitalism is rampant in the world. Money and greed are present in the world in a way they weren't in the 1940s. Brutalism is a cleansing thing, an attitude of mind. So finding St. Peter's today, what can it offer our era, in which the recycling and use of limited resources are timely once again? Thanks. Next image. No, thank you. Now, in 2008, a team that was led by Avanti Architects published a conservation assessment of St. Peter's, commissioned by the Archdiocese of Glasgow and funded by Historic Scotland. And the site has decayed further since then. And concrete's tendency to form surface cracks allows water penetration to initiate alkaline silicate reactions, causing steel to corrode and concrete to fracture and break. But no evidence of concrete cancer has yet been discovered. Now, conservation is the term that is generally applied to the looking after buildings in this country. And it's a term which really derives from John Ruskin, the 19th century theorist. And the Ruskinian model of conservation concludes that any attempt at restoration is inauthentic because it destroys a building's past and thus its value in the present and future. And John Ruskin's approach was diametrically opposed to that of his contemporary, Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who favoured a restoration policy that, in valuing one era above all others, constructed an ideal that may never have existed, removing unwanted remains that do not fit this model. And restoration became prevalent in France and the rest of Europe, but not in Britain. Now, today, in many nations, both practices are appreciated, and conservation requires subtle and unseen maintenance, which can, like its counterpart, restoration, lead to the denial of further change. Next image, please. Conceiving the past as a palimpsest, conservation requires appreciation of what is absent as well as what is present, indicating that something is unnoticed or hidden, absent or incomplete. A void invites the user to imagine what is there and thus to make it anew. An expectant, productive opening between seemingly more substantial conditions. A void may be spatial, functional, sensual, semantic, material, or temporal. And intriguingly, varied voids, all these voids exist at St. Peter's. The spatial void is a perceived emptiness ready to be transformed by experience. The functional void exists when function is undefined or absent, to be decided by user preparation, not architect design or building management. And the sensual void occurs when several senses contradict each other or one is depleted. The semantic void arises when certain characteristics expected of the building, such as solidity, utility, or enclosure, are undermined or missing. And the material void is the perceived absence of matter as much as the actual absence of matter. And overarching all of these is the temporal void. And the temporal void occurs when something is delayed or appears at the wrong time. St. Peter's is a montage of voids that occur simultaneously and sequentially, which future architects should conserve, not eradicate. And decades of ruination should not be retained merely as an aesthetic backdrop to a newly functioning building. Instead, if St. Peter's is to simultaneously become part building and part ruin, the aim must be to do the minimum, to insert what is only poetically and pragmatically necessary, and to find ways to live in a living ruin. This is the penultimate section. It is a rewilded architecture. A living ruin combines many pasts, presents, and possible futures. And this is obviously why I'm distinguishing a living ruin from a ruin. A living room is a room we occupy and live in. And the living room that has the layering of one time on another, the times of design, the times of use, the times of vandalism, the times of graffiti, the times of wind, trees, and spiders. The fragile remnants of the 19th century landscape, burns, ravines, bridges, pathways, a lake and a walled garden, the Chilean lantern tree, Himalayan lily, Japanese Andromeda, Japanese maple, Scots pine, beech, birch, rhododendron, rowan, sycamore, yew, and giant redwood as self-seeded exotic plants. The badger, fox, otter, pine marten, red squirrel, water vole, great crested newt, toad, frog, bat, numerous birds and insects. The pitch black dark of a winter day, the woodland sounds within the concrete labyrinth, the algae, moss, and graffiti on every surface. Next image. A living ruin, I'd argue, is timely, a model for architecture now and in the immediate future, a call to the critical creative imagination in an era of environmental awareness, biodiversity, and climate change, a co-production and cohabitation of multiple authors with a human, non-human, or atmospheric, a rewelded architecture as well as a rewelded landscape, a montage of voids. Conceiving architecture is a dialogue between a building and a ruin, which may fall into decay, rise into built form, or oscillate between the two, intensifies the already blurred relations between presence and absence, growth and decay, life and death, potential and loss, the unfinished and the undone, indicated that a work of architecture can remain incomplete, literally and in the imagination, questioning the recurring cycles of production, obsolescence, and waste, feed consumption in the capitalist society. So this is the final section, which I'm going to sort of try to take some of the themes from the talk and to talk slightly more generally about them. It's obviously called Architecture as a Time Machine. This is one of Tian, both these two final images are taken by Tian Zhou. I think rather like we often assume that the vision is truthful, and actually the eye doesn't receive enough information to really sort of create an image, so the brain has to extrapolate from that. I think also we tend to universalize and generalize time, but actually time is relative. Affected by speed and mass, time is faster at the equator than the far north, faster in the mountains than the plains, and rather nicely to think about now, actually faster at your head than your feet, which is quite a thought really when you think about it. So light weaves through space-time, and the stars we observe in a night sky are in the past, not in the present. Equally, see, when we look up today, see this beautiful sunny day, we see the past sun, not the present sun. And architects do not necessarily design for today. It seems an obvious thing to recognize, but they often have another time, a different time and place in mind. Some architects conceive for a present, some imagine for a mythical past, or a patron who imagines for a mythical past. A good example of that is obviously King Charles, as he now is. Well, others design for a future. Alternatively, an architect can envisage the past, the present, and the future in a single architecture. And innovations occur when ideas and forms migrate from one time and place to another by a translation process that is as inventive as the initial conception. And a design can therefore be specific to a time and a place and a compound of other times and places. And we tend to think, when we're sitting here with our screens or computer tables, as design in the first stage of a temporal sequence. But actually, design, construction, maintenance, and ruination more often occur simultaneously while a building is in use, fluctuating according to specific spaces and components, and assembled from materials of diverse ages, from the newly formed to those centuries or millions of years old, and incorporating varying rates of transformation decay. A building ruin can curate the past, inform the present, and imagine the future, transporting us to many times simultaneously. For example, the stones of a concrete structure belong to the geological time they were wrought, the time they were quarried, the time they were integrated into a construction site, the ever-progressing time of subsequent environmental change, and the varied times they are experienced. We may seem to travel back in time, while materials and components have literally travelled forward to us. Just as much as any collection of papers or drawings, a building is an archive. A building is an evolving collection of ideas, values, and materials, with the capacity to acknowledge the histories and timeframes of related disciplines, whether thousands of archaeological years or millions of geological ones. For example, gazing at the stone aggregate in a concrete wall, we can appreciate the geological abyss of deep time, this sort of vastness of geological time. Our thoughts may be cast back to a pre-human era when ancient civilizations inhabited the earth, or forward to a post-human era when humans are extinct. If we contemplate a sedimentary stone, we see time's arrow and the possibility of ruin. If we gaze at a metamorphic stone, we see time's cycle and the possibility of repair. So, final image. So architecture is an art of forgetting as well as an art of remembering. Each building is selective, focusing on some ideas and ignoring others. And original meanings are soon obscured or transformed unless they are continuously reaffirmed through everyday behaviour and maintenance, which are as necessary to perpetuating collective memory as any material object. Rather than just living in the moment, we filter the present through memories of the past and speculations on the future. And as we move from place to place, we may seem to move backwards in time or forwards in time or oscillate between the two. In many time travel tales, the protagonists wish to change time, not just observe it. But since H.G. Wells coined the term in 1895, the time machine is notably unreliable, stimulating narrative tension. Architecture is also an erratic rather than a reliable time machine. It cannot change the past, but it may alter our understanding of the past, while it can potentially change the future. We all know the sense that time is reversed, and an era that seemed to be the past becomes the future. I think we're very much seeing that now, because in the 21st century, the environmental catastrophe of 20th century agricultural overproduction now sees hedgerows replanted, industrial pesticides discarded, and farms rewilded. And the low tolerance and high failure rates of complex building systems sees thermal comfort reassessed and traditional technologies revived. 21st century architects, therefore, can appreciate the shock of the old as well as the shock of the new. And to ask what is new involves other questions. Why is it new? How is it new? And where is it new? In William Gibson's memorable statement, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And to understand what is new, we need to consider the present, the past, and maybe even the future. We need to think historically. Defining something as new is an inherently historical act because it requires an awareness of what is old. Architecture is a time machine. Thank you very much.